Hi, Rhett McLaughlin, not to be confused with Sarah McLaughlin.
In the arms of the angel.
As the cheese drops from your Taco Bell glove.
Easy mistake. And Alex O'Connor were talking about Jesus recently. They were sharing some thoughts, and now I have some thoughts to share about the thoughts that they shared. It was a long conversation, but we're just going to talk about a bit of it. And that bit is at around an hour when they start talking about the resurrection.
You know, it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. You know, probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective. This feeling began to creep in, which was like, okay, well, maybe he did rise from the dead, but what I've learned about the process of historical investigation, and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead. In my compulsion to believe that he raised from the dead, it is a religious position. It is a faith position. It's not an historically defensible position to the degree that these Christian apologists make it out to be.
Now let's circle back over some of the evidence surrounding the resurrection. We have various accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Within those accounts, we have the women finding the tomb, which was not a mark of confidence in first century Israel. That wouldn't have been a flattering part of the story. Also, his disciples were freaked out and hiding. And then following the resurrection, we have sightings by various people. The estimated time of writing of the Gospels is quite early, with people still being alive that would have been alive during the events that were reported. And we even have an early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which could be dated to around 5 years of the crucifixion. Then we have Paul's follow-up information around that. Speaking of Paul, you have Paul's context and conversion. We have a Jewish man who did a 180 from killing Christians to serving them after meeting Jesus and having his heart changed. So that's pretty crazy. And you have all this Jesus stuff in the Gospels happening in fulfillment of Old Testament scripture with Old Testament context attached. The whole thing is intertwined. This is an area that I think is often ignored in these conversations. We have a robust and cohesive narrative about who Christ is and what he did, which has a historical reality and grounding to it. But he mentions the question, why would somebody die for a lie? And then mentions that perhaps the writers or the disciples, different people, were deceived. But we should also ask, why would anyone make up this lie? And how? Think about the complexity of coming up with a story like this. Why would a bunch of first century Jewish people come up with this very non-standard and non-flattering Messiah figure? And here's Ben Shapiro, popular Jewish man, on that.
Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy, going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense. Presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
Now, of course, Christians take a different perspective on this, but why, from that context, would we have a servant king, son of God, die as a perfect sacrificial lamb and rise from the grave. A servant king who teaches us to die to ourselves and bear our cross. What would anyone gain from this at the time? There was nothing to gain for whoever would develop this legend. What would they gain from defying the Jewish leadership and Roman authorities? And what would they lose? Things didn't go well for the Christians. The most a first century Christian would get out of this is some community and the prospect of a potential painful death by stoning always looming on the horizon. Yikes. This conversation is framed as if we can simply assume that the writers are being deceived or deceptive, and there's a bunch of conjecture options that don't have a historical basis presented as a way to have an alternative view on the reports. But what if we were to be charitable to the writers? What if they were being honest? What if they were treating this information with great care and seriousness, like Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15? Why assume they weren't doing that? Is it because it's a supernatural claim? And for example, what if we had this level of evidence and reporting about the crash of the Hindenburg? Would people have the same lack of charity towards the writers, or in this case, reporters, journalists? What if we had a bunch of writings about only the teachings of Christ that we all tend to like and tend to agree on? Would we assume deception or development? And I find that a lot of times people will say, oh yeah, he probably said that, but he didn't say that. Something to think about. Alex also talks about the concept of a new tomb and how that's spoken about in the Gospels.
Came across an interesting idea a friend told me. I wish I could remember exactly how this goes, but
I also want to show grace to Alex and Rhett in this conversation because I understand that they're making remarks off the top of their head in the middle of an hour-plus long conversation. With that said, I do think it's good to respond to what they're saying.
I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So like in Mark's Gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. And in Matthew's Gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb. And so you're right that when those little questions, well, are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations potentially in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit.
So yes, Mark doesn't describe a new tomb. Matthew says a new tomb, Luke refers to a tomb where no one has ever lain, and John refers to a new tomb in which no one has yet been laid. Is this apologetic development? Well, only if you want to see it that way. Mark 15:46 says, then he, Joseph of Arimathea, bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. Knowing who Joseph of Arimathea was would imply a new tomb in this culture. Not a mass grave, not a common grave, and it's not saying it was not a new tomb. Anyone reading in the first century would assume it was either a new tomb, or that, if anything, perhaps he had another family member or two in there. I think they would know who Jesus was either way. The fact that Mark didn't explicitly describe the tomb as new doesn't mean that it wasn't new. Another question to ask is, if we only had 2 Gospels, would this same concern be raised? Wouldn't it be easier to say that one just left the detail off? Alex also talks about the part in Matthew about the guards at the tomb.
Like how Matthew's Gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone, and the Jews pay the guards and say, you're going to spread the rumor that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that. We'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew's Gospel.
And what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool, admitting that there is this rumor that the body was stolen, and thereby having to invent the guards at the tomb to protect against that? Maybe there were guards. Like, we can't prove that there weren't. But when you start to see how much potential apologetical motivation is underlying these claims in these Gospels, which although broadly seeming to be attempts at historical biography, are also just full of what is probably best thought of as mythical storytelling, becomes really difficult. Dale Allison talks.
I don't care about Dale, Alex. Just kidding. Could you imagine if I was like that? So the guards and the entire stolen body rumor are only mentioned in Matthew. In Matthew 27, we have the concern of the disciples taking the body, which explains why there would be guards. And then in Matthew 28, we have the follow-up where the guards are bribed. Well, we could flip this around and say that Matthew's inclusion was because he was attempting to counter a stolen body rumor because it was actually happening. And this sounds like just the kind of theory that could pop up if a rabbi is saying that he's going to raise from the dead, and then after he dies, his followers are running around saying he rose from the dead. Alex and Rhett here seem to be perfectly happy to take the side of the stolen bodyists, which I think proves my point a little bit. John, the latest gospel, does not include this story. So John wasn't just copying Matthew if Matthew made this thing up, and now John's over here being deceived and making things up as well, or, joining in on the deception. There's just differences in what is being reported in the Gospels. So then Alex describes the Gospels as historical biography mixed with mythical storytelling. Now, I think this take doesn't align with the apparent motivations of the writers. And the use of the term mythology creates a stilted view. I think a better way to put it is it's historical biography that reports supernatural events. And we can discuss if these supernatural events occurred and if supernatural events can occur, but I don't think mythological is the right term. Mythology is a term that we modern folks like to use to describe stories with fantastical and supernatural elements in them. But also, as Wes Huff mentioned on the Joe Rogan podcast, everybody believed in supernatural stuff back then.
Everybody believed in supernatural events.
See, there you go. Thanks, Wes. Just kidding. I'll let him go on.
Like, there's no such thing as like a secular work in the ancient world. Even Plutarch, who's one of the most famous biographers in the ancient world, he wrote 90 biographies, of which 60 still survive today. He was a priest of Apollo. So, like, he's already assuming that the gods exist, that crazy things are going to happen in the world. They didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening.
So there wasn't really a secular materialist mindset. And you could say that means that people would be quick to label things as supernatural. But I think the nature of what we find in the Gospels helps lend credibility to the idea that these things actually happened. And there's a historical grounding to what is being reported. It's not like some sort of fable that has no historical existence. It just exists in a book, right? So there's a lot of details that one could explore there, but I just wanted to touch on that point. So then Alex mentions the raising of the graves in Matthew.
Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's gospel at the time of Jesus'
which
death.
is bonkers.
Absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open. And the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection. And it's a really weird, clunky wording, because it says that the graves opened when Jesus died. But then it said that the people appeared to many after the resurrection, as if like they were just laying dead in the open tomb for 3 days or something. Like, it's weirdly worded. And you've got this, and Matthew's the only one who reports it. And you've got this undertone of Jesus being the firstborn of the dead. And it's like, okay, like Dale Allison is pretty convinced this didn't actually happen. It's another question whether Matthew thought it happened.
Right.
But the problem is that if Matthew didn't, this is just a bit of myth that Matthew is obviously telling some kind of allegorical story. What does that mean? It means that Matthew is willing to make up stories about resurrecting people from the dead in order to serve a theological
If it happened
point.
once.
And then the floodgates are open, especially because Matthew's gospel is the earliest gospel that has any post-resurrection appearances recorded in it. Boom.
So if this was a fabricated tale with apologetic motivations, wouldn't we not see quote-unquote clunky wording? Wouldn't the writer want to streamline things? I personally wouldn't describe this as clunky, but awkward to our modern sensibilities because it is compressed and telescoped. Today we would want to write this as something like, there was an earthquake which caused the rocks to split and various tombs to be opened. Following Jesus' resurrection, the saints were raised as well and left their tombs. After that, they went to the holy city and appeared to many people. Here's some cell phone footage captured by bystanders. But that's not how first century Matthew wrote. What we have is a highly paraphrased account, and I think a reasonable interpretation is that perhaps the tombs were opened during the earthquake, then the bodies were raised later when Jesus resurrected. In other words, there's a gap between the opening of the tomb and the bodies being raised. I think the fact that they did not appear before the resurrection and that they got out of their tombs after the resurrection would imply that interpretation. Alex is saying that perhaps Matthew introduced a bit of myth here for theological reasons, but we have no reason to assume that was Matthew's intent. That's not apparent in the gospel, which, by the way, begins with a genealogy, setting the tone for a historically toned gospel. Why assume this is myth, other than the differences between gospels, which can be explained by the fact that the writers are different writers who want to talk about different things for different reasons, or because this involves a supernatural occurrence? Especially when you have 3 other gospels which align on so many of the other details around Jesus' life and the resurrection. So according to Alex, we potentially have Mark either being deceived himself or making up stuff in the Gospel of Mark regarding presumably various elements of Jesus' miracles and resurrection. And then we have somebody introducing a new tomb theory after Mark, and then we have Matthew making up stuff as well. This is a rather elaborate situation with no evidence other than the differences in information being reported across gospels, which have other fine explanations if you assume that they're not being deceptive. And so, yeah, you can come up with a bunch of different reasons to imagine why the writers would be being deceptive, but that doesn't mean that that's the best explanation for what's going on there. Rhett, at this point, is clearly coming to this as a very skeptical person of the Bible and the Christian faith because he has his other reasons for not believing it to be true. So it seems like perhaps what's happening is that his presupposition is that this probably is not true.
What seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead.
My challenge to agnostic, atheists, other non-believer folks out there is to imagine what things would look like if we turned down the skepticism dial a little bit and that we were charitable to the writers and we didn't assume that they were either being deceived or deceiving, especially within the context that they operate, the first century Jewish context. I just think assuming deception in the Gospels creates a really complex and confusing situation when we look at the historical reality that they operated in. And things like 1 Corinthians 15. There were a lot of odds against the Christian faith ever getting off the ground, and a lot less odds against anyone who wanted to give an alternate report of what happened, just theoretically. So I'll wrap it up there. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below and engage with you guys. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a lovely day. God bless. Bye.